Hi again. In Kenneth Latourette, A History of Christianity, page 260, just before this, Latourette has been analyzing the threat from paganism, which, if you're coming from a cult background, you know is the dominant thought that somehow Christianity was corrupted, completely overrun and infected by paganism. He has said that really didn't happen, although it was influenced by paganism. In some senses, never were its basic teachings corrupted by pagan ideas, or the testimony of the creeds, which we'll get into more here. The creeds, in effect, were designed to protect the church from that happening. They succeeded in protecting it from doctrinal corruption, that is, the creeds did, but they didn't succeed completely in keeping it from being influenced, and some would say corrupted, by pagan ideas, but not the major doctrine. So that's a distinction, of course, if you're coming from a cult background, you don't recognize. Then he talks about a greater peril, as far as Latourette is concerned, was Greek philosophy. Probably an even greater peril came from Greek philosophy. This was the temptation to regard Christianity as a philosophy, better than that of the Greeks, but not essentially different. Truth to be arrived at by the application of the human mind and of man's rational processes. Fully to yield would be to ignore the fundamental contrast which we have noted, and to denature the Christian faith. Fortunately for Christianity, its intellectuals who most profoundly influenced the future course of the faith never entirely succumbed to this tendency. For example, Augustine, while retaining much of the Neoplatonism which had once captivated him, held it to be basically defective in not taking cognizance of the Incarnation. Moreover, as we have said, Augustine, in his famous "Believe in order that you may understand," while by no means repudiating reason, was giving to it a different place than that accorded it in the Greek philosophy, and, along with other Christian thinkers, was taking account of data which were unknown to the pre-Christian Greeks, and which were rejected as foolishness by those who continued to adhere to Greek philosophy. Of course, that's an allusion to Paul himself in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and 2. Yet Christians made substantial appropriations from Greek philosophy. Clement of Alexandria and Ambrose of Milan based much of their ethics on what they had learned from Stoicism. The writings of the Stoic Epictetus, somewhat modified to make them more palatable, had a wide circulation in Christian circles. To be sure, Christians took over from Stoicism only what they believed to be consistent with their faith, and would have nothing to do with the basic pantheism of that philosophy, which would deny the opposition of God to sin and look forward to the consummation of the kingdom of God, rather than backward to a golden age, as did the Stoics. But Christian ethics were long to give evidence of Stoic contributions. Platonism had a marked influence on Christianity. It entered from many channels, among them the Hellenistic Jew Philo, who was utilized by some early Christian writers, and through Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Augustine, and the writings which bore the name of Dionysius the Areopagite. The term logos, which was extensively employed by Christians as they thought about the relation of Christ to God, came from Greek philosophy, perhaps by way of both Stoicism and Platonism. We have seen how the Christian creeds employed technical terms from Greek and Latin. With these, as with the word logos, pre-Christian connotations would inevitably enter. However, as we earlier suggested, the creeds never became really Greek. They sought to express convictions which were central in the gospel and peculiar to it. They were distinctively Christian and not Hellenistic. Moreover, it has been suggested that Christian thinkers solved the problems of order and change, reason and emotion, the physical and the intellectual, with which classical philosophy had wrestled, and did so without denying the validity of the changing, the emotional, or the physical. They thereby provided a basis for individual salvation in a world of dislocated individuals, and a principle on which a stable but not a rigid society might be based. What in many ways proved the menace which was most nearly disastrous was that presented by the kind of power on which the Roman Empire was founded. Kind of power, as we have seen, which was in complete contradiction to that seen in the cross. From the very beginning, pride of place and the desire for control in the Christian community were chronic temptations. On the very eve of the crucifixion, first on the way to Jerusalem and then at the final supper, in the inner circle among those who were to be the apostles of the good news, there were some who sought superior rank and recognition as the greatest, incidents which led to characteristically vivid sayings from Jesus, and which may have been the reason for the assumption by him of the menial role of washing the disciples' feet. By word and by deed, Jesus put in stark contrast the two kinds of greatness, that esteemed by the kings of the Gentiles, namely the one in vogue in the Roman Empire, and that which should characterize his disciples. It was the contrast between those who, from the vantage of visible power established and maintained by crude force, professed to seek to do good, and were called benefactors, and those who humbly served in tasks which were despised in the other kind of society. In one of the letters preserved in the New Testament, there is evidence, as we have said, of sharp conflict between the author, who believed himself vested with authority in one of the churches, and another, who loveth preeminence. This, I think, is a reference to 3 John, and a man called Diotrephes. Again and again, even in the brief summary of the preceding pages, we have caught glimpses of similar incidents. The various churches, including the Catholic Church, creations of Christianity, and the visible vehicles by which it was transmitted, were clearly institutions, even before Christianity was accorded toleration by the state, and while it was still subject to chronic or intermittent persecutions, not a few of its bishops were accused of striving for prestige and were entering into intrigues and exerting the kind of power which was akin to that of the dignitaries of the state. Some of the bishops were surrounded by pomp and maintained households and a manner of life which rivaled those of civil officials. Indeed, it is a question whether any visible institution, especially if it becomes large, can avoid falling victim, in part, to trends in the direction of the power which crucified Jesus. The danger to Christianity was augmented when the state made its peace with the church. Until then, as we have seen, Christians tended to keep aloof from government, and many, perhaps the majority of the Christians, believed that loyalty to Christ was inconsistent with holding civil or military office or serving in the army. Beginning with Constantine, that attitude was weakened. The emperors and an increasing proportion of the officials and of the troops assumed the Christian name. In these positions, they, perforce, exercised the sort of power on which the state rested. Christian officials had to make choices for the state among courses, none of which was in full conformity with Christian principles, and to take action which entailed the use of the kind of force on which the state was built. Emperors exercised their power to interfere in the affairs of the church. To be sure, they did this primarily in an effort to bring unity to the church, and through the prestige of their position, more than through naked force, and in this may be seen something of the ameliorative influence of Christianity. Yet here was still power, which was in contrast with that vividly displayed in the cross. This peril, as we are to see, became more marked in the succeeding centuries. In the West, as the Roman Empire declined, the Catholic Church took over many of the functions previously performed by the state. In the East, in the area where the empire continued, the tie between church and state was very close, and the church was in large degree controlled by the state and was used to serve the latter's purposes. Put in a link to Northrop Frye, the great Canadian literary critic, perhaps the most famous literary critic in the world, about 50 years ago. Northrop Frye, in his book The Great Code, talks about the two reasons Christianity conquered not only the Roman Empire, but paganism as a whole. I'll put that link on your screen. See you next time.